The fluorescent lights hummed their steady mechanical prayer above the emergency department at Seattle General, and Natalie Hayes moved through the controlled chaos like water finding its level. For hours into the shift, 23 patients cycled through. 16 of them stable, 5 upgraded, 2 still waiting for beds that wouldn't come until someone upstairs decided to discharge. She'd stopped counting the decisions that weren't hers to make years ago. Bay 7 held a Coast Guard general with a non-critical admission, shrapnel from an old IED injury in Helmand Province acting up again, the kind of ghost pain that made powerful men admit they needed help. Natalie's hands moved across his vitals with the precise economy of someone who'd done this in field tents and forward operating bases, not just sterile hospital bays. Temperature, heart rate, oxygen saturation. All normal. All exactly where they should be. She'd already spotted what Dr. Pierce was about to miss, the subtle elevation in his white blood cell count on the intake labs, the way his left shoulder tensed when he breathed too deeply. Not critical. Not yet. But somewhere in that wound, something was beginning to fester. The general's eyes tracked her movements like a man trying to place someone he'd met in a previous life. Natalie's jaw remained perfectly relaxed. Her hands didn't falter. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining hung on the chair beside Bay 7's equipment tray, just another piece of nursing gear, just another anonymous uniform. Not a legend. Not a call sign whispered in classified briefings. Just a nurse doing her job like 40,000 other nurses across Denver did theirs, invisible and interchangeable. That's an interesting choice, Dr. Pierce said from behind her. She didn't turn. She finished running the oximeter across the general's finger and noted the reading. 98%. Perfect. Before line, Pierce continued. Most nurses use the antecubital fossa. Standard. Clean. Textbook. He said textbook the way other men said unforgivable. You've placed it in the cephalic vein, which is somewhat creative. The antecubital site will restrict his movement for 48 hours, Natalie said, her voice the flat, measured tone of someone reading a weather report. He needs to mobilize the shoulder. Cephalic gives him range. Pierce's smile arrived like winter. Does it? She turned then, meeting his eyes with the perfect blankness of someone who'd learned long ago that showing nothing was the only armor that worked. 31 years old. Hands that had held trauma shears and M16s and dying soldiers and standard-issue stethoscopes. Eyes that had seen 3 a.m. in Sanjin Valley and 3 a.m. in hospital corridors and found them equally relentless. But what Dr. Pierce saw was a nurse who'd just corrected him in front of a patient. I'm sure you know best, she said quietly. I can change it if you'd like. The pause lasted exactly 2 seconds. In that silence lived the entire architecture of institutional hierarchy, who made decisions, who executed them, who apologized for thinking they knew anything at all. Pierce nodded once, slow, like a man cataloging something he planned to address later. Bay 3 needs an EKG, he said. And don't forget that nurses aren't physicians, Natalie. It's important to remember that distinction. She moved without responding, her body already transitioning toward the next crisis, the next patient, the next chance to be invisible. Muscle memory took over. Fingers that had placed central lines under fire now found the EKG machine by touch alone, wheeling it toward Bay 3 with the kind of efficiency that made observation hard. A 64-year-old man with palpitations and anxiety. Standard presentation. Standard workup. Standard everything. But when she placed the electrodes and watched the 12-lead print across the monitor, her hands paused for exactly 1 second. The T-wave showed a subtle inversion in the lateral leads. The heart was working hard, working wrong, working like someone who knew something the patient didn't. She'd seen this pattern before. 23 years of medicine, 14 of those in field stations where you had to be your own cardiologist because help was 40 kilometers away and wouldn't arrive for 3 hours. She reached for the phone at the nursing station. Bay 3 needs drive Pierce. Possible and STEMI. Get cardiology up here. The charge nurse didn't hesitate. No one ever did when Natalie called for something. She had the kind of voice that didn't ask permission. The kind of clinical confidence that either came from institutional authority or came from somewhere else entirely, somewhere that didn't require a title to sound like a command. The next 30 seconds happened like a practiced choreography. Dr. Pierce arrived with his entourage of residents who still thought they knew what they were doing. Natalie had the patient's chart ready, vitals, history, medications, the EKG printout clipped to the front. No flourish. No explanation. Just the facts, arranged in the order a competent physician would need them. Pierce scanned the chart and looked at the monitor. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Who called this?" he asked. "I did," Natalie said. He stared at the lateral leads for 3 more seconds, then nodded at the residents. Troponin level. Nitroglycerine 0.4 milligrams sublingual. Get him to cardiology. He didn't thank her. Didn't acknowledge that she'd spotted something he would have ordered a standard workup for and missed. In the hospital hierarchy, recognition flowed upward only. Nurses who diagnosed conditions stayed invisible. Doctors who ordered tests took the credit when the tests confirmed what nurses had already known. Natalie was already moving toward the supply station when she heard one of the residents whisper to another, "How did she know?" The response was quieter, but not quiet enough. Some nurses just have good instincts. Lucky, I guess. Lucky. As if 30 years of pattern recognition and field medicine and nights in countries that didn't have names on most American maps could be reduced to luck. As if the way her brain processed a patient's breathing rhythm and skin tone and the microtremor in their voice was just intuition instead of the residue of trauma and training and 1,000 moments where being wrong meant people died. She didn't flinch. Didn't react. Just pulled the stock she needed and continued her rounds with the same measured efficiency she brought to every moment of every shift. This was the performance. This was the costume. This was the version of Natalie Hayes that Dr. Pierce understood and could condescend to and eventually fire, because of course he would fire her. The only thing more threatening to a man like that than a nurse who knew more than he did was a nurse who knew more than he did and never asked permission to prove it. General Marcus Webb was waiting when she returned to Bay 7. His fall was running clean, his wound was healing in the standard progression of a privileged body with access to the best medicine money could provide, and his eyes were still tracking her with that frustrated sense of proximity to recognition he couldn't quite grasp. "You were in Helmand," he said. It wasn't a question. Natalie's hands didn't pause. She adjusted his fluid rate with the same precision she brought to everything else, and when she spoke, her voice remained flat and professional and completely devoid of anything that might be mistaken for confirmation or denial. "I'm just a nurse," she said. The general's expression shifted into something that might have been recognition, or might have been the kind of pain that came from wounds that didn't show on imaging. He nodded slowly, like he'd just received the answer to a question he'd stopped asking years ago. Behind them, the emergency department continued its endless cycle of crisis and recovery and the slow grinding work of keeping broken people alive. Dr. Pierce was writing his orders in Bay 3, his voice loud enough to make sure everyone heard his diagnostic brilliance. The monitor in Bay 7 beeped its steady electronic reassurance. Somewhere down the hallway, someone was coding, and a team of residents was running toward the sound like believers running toward salvation. Natalie Hayes moved through it all with the steady precision of someone who'd worked under worse pressure, and no one here had any idea that the quietest person in the room was the only one who could actually save them when the real emergency arrived. Thursday morning arrived with the particular fluorescent brightness of a hospital in full daylight, and Dr. Pierce had positioned himself at the lectern like a prosecutor preparing his case. 23 residents and attending physicians filled the Grand Rounds auditorium, all eyes forward, all waiting for the weekly bloodletting that Pierce had perfected into an art form. He adjusted his tie, our Italian silk, starched white, the uniform of someone who believed his wardrobe was a credential, and clicked to the first slide. Natalie's chart notes appeared on the projection screen, magnified to the size of an accusation. "Here," Pierce said, his voice carrying the texture of gravel under expensive shoes, "we have Nurse Hayes deciding that established protocols don't apply to her particular clinical judgment." He read aloud, inflecting her assessment with theatrical mockery, "for placement suboptimal. Recommend relocated line to left antecubital fossa. Suboptimal. He looked up over his glasses. Nurses don't recommend relocations. Doctors recommend relocations. Nurses execute orders. A resident in the third row exchanged a smirk with his neighbor. Pierce noticed. He always noticed when the room moved with him. This, he continued, advancing to the next slide, her notes on the cardiac arrest she'd caught before it arrived, is what we in the medical community call dangerous cowboy medicine. A nurse sees a pattern, decides she's a cardiologist, and writes an assessment that contradicts the attending physician's evaluation. He set the remote down slowly. This is how people die. Not from disease. From ego masquerading as clinical competence. In the back corner of the auditorium, Natalie stood with her hands folded in front of her, her white coat crisp, her expression arranged into the precise blankness of someone attending a conference she'd already decided to ignore. Her jaw tightened. Just once. Just enough that if you knew to look for it, you would catch the muscles clenching under her skin like a fist closing around something sharp. But her eyes remained steady. Her breathing didn't accelerate. Her posture didn't shift. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Pierce clicked through for more slides, her charting from Monday, her note about the respiratory patient's declining status, her recommendation that a stat chest X-ray would likely show pneumothorax. Each one a crime he was prosecuting in front of an audience that still believed he was protecting hospital standards rather than protecting his own infallibility. Nurses, he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, rumbling with authority, are essential. Absolutely essential. But only when they remain in their lane. Nurse Hayes appears to believe her lane is much wider than hospital policy allows. The residents nodded. The attending physician scribbled notes. One older doctor in the front row didn't look up from his coffee, but Pierce didn't notice the disinterest because he was already moving toward his conclusion, a closing statement that would feel like vindication to anyone who believed hierarchy was the same thing as competence. I expect, he said, directly to Natalie now, though his voice carried to the entire room, that we'll see a marked improvement in compliance with established protocols. Won't we, Nurse Hayes? She nodded. One motion. Her hands didn't move. The auditorium dismissed in waves, residents peeling off toward the hallway in clusters, already returning to their phones and their coffee and their own small kingdoms of responsibility. Pierce remained at the lectern, straightening his notes, basking in the particular satisfaction of a public execution that everyone had attended but no one would acknowledge. Natalie left the auditorium last, moving through the dissipating crowd like someone swimming against a current no one else could feel. She had trained for 16 years in Helmand Province and 3 other theaters of war, had held pressure on femoral arteries while explosions echoed outside surgical tents, had called medevacs with her hands shaking and her voice steady. She could survive Dr. Pierce's contempt. The problem was that surviving him required silence, and silence was the same language they'd used when they pulled her from Kandahar and told her there was a position in Denver that needed her unique skill set. That was how they'd framed her extraction, a position. Not a demotion. Not a punishment for asking too many questions about why the Coast Guard wanted her to monitor a general who'd arrived at Seattle General with no medical record and a level of tactical awareness that suggested his weekend hobby was more than fishing. She moved through the corridor toward the vending machine on the 3rd floor, her motions precise, her breathing controlled. This was a place she'd learned to inhabit, the space between what was happening and how she felt about what was happening. It was a narrow space, and it had gotten narrower since Pierce arrived. The vending machine hummed its mechanical song. Natalie inserted bills, $3, and selected the coffee that would taste like chemicals and discipline. She needed the caffeine more than the flavor. Pierce was waiting on the other side of the machine, positioning himself with the casual inevitability of a natural predator, flanked by 3 interns who didn't yet understand they were props in someone else's performance. He was already speaking before she'd finished extracting her cup. Do nurses with hero complexes realize they're not actually doctors? He asked, his audience twitching with anticipatory laughter. Or is that too complicated a concept? One of the interns laughed. The other 2 followed, the herd instinct overwhelming any independent thought. Natalie's hand closed around the coffee cup. The plastic was still warm. She turned, met Pierce's eyes with an expression that showed nothing, not anger, not hurt, not the cascade of recognition that she'd heard this exact same tone in the Kandahar Regional Military Hospital when she'd questioned whether a patient needed surgical exploration or conservative management. Back then, the doctor had been right. She'd been wrong. She'd accepted the correction and moved on. She had been younger then. She had believed that competence would eventually be recognized, that asking questions meant you cared about outcomes. She had not yet learned that some people experienced questions as threats. She walked past the group without speaking. The vending machine's compressor hummed behind her like a small mechanical prayer. The third reprimand came in the evening, during her double shift outside Bay 7, where General Marcus Webb was resting beneath a blanket that looked too thin to protect anything but the hospital's liability. He was awake, his eyes tracked her movements with that unsettling awareness that suggested his presence at Seattle General was not accidental, and Pierce timed his confrontation for the moment when Webb could see and hear every word. "If you ever countermand my orders again," Pierce said, his voice dropping into the register of genuine threat, "I will have security escort you out of this building. Are we clear, Nurse Hayes?" The emphasis on nurse dripped like something toxic. She nodded. "Once. I need verbal confirmation, nurse." His eyes were moving, calculating whether this moment could be documented, weaponized, entered into some record that would live longer than either of them. "Clear," she said. "Excellent." He smiled, a shark smile, all teeth and no warmth, and moved toward the door. Before he left, he turned back. "You're very good at following instructions. Let's keep it that way." He was gone before she could respond, and Webb was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite parse, something between recognition and sorrow, as if he'd just understood something he'd hoped to be wrong about. Natalie finished checking his vitals in silence. His heart rate was steady. His O2 sat was 98%. His 4 was running at the correct rate. Everything was exactly where it should be, which meant nothing, because nothing was actually where it should be. At 10:48 p.m., when the hallway had emptied into that particular darkness of a hospital's third shift, Natalie entered the supply closet and pressed her forehead against the cold metal shelving. The metal was real. The cold was real. These were facts her body could understand even when the rest of her existence had become abstract. She breathed. In through her nose. For counts. Hold. For counts. Out through her mouth. For counts. The technique that had kept her conscious during a shrapnel wound in her left leg. The technique that had kept her focused during 14 hours of defending a field hospital against fighters who understood that destroying medics destroys hope. The shells held bandages and saline and the accumulated detritus of emergency care, each item labeled with precision, each one a small evidence that order was possible in chaos. She had believed that once. She had believed that if she just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, executed protocol perfectly enough, the world would recognize competence as a currency that mattered. But competence mattered less than obedience, and obedience mattered less than protecting people like Dr. Pierce from the reality that they were not indispensable. She was indispensable. The field hospital she'd held for 14 hours had trained every person in her unit to function without her, and that was the mark of true leadership. She had trained them that way because the alternative was becoming irreplaceable, which was the same thing as becoming a prisoner. The fluorescent light in the supply closet buzzed with the particular irritation of bad electrical work. Somewhere below, in Seattle General's emergency department, a monitor was probably alarming. Someone's heart was probably doing something it wasn't supposed to do. And somewhere in Bay 7, a general who shouldn't have been there was probably lying awake, understanding exactly what it meant that the quietest person in the room was the one holding everything together, and that people like Dr. Pierce would never forgive her for it. She pressed her forehead harder against the metal shelf and breathed. The 2:53 a.m. shift had the quality of silence that comes before everything breaks. Natalie stood at the medication cart in the back corridor of Seattle General's emergency department, counting ampoules of epinephrine with the methodical precision that made her dangerous. 3 men came through the ambulance bay entrance at 2:51. She didn't look up. Didn't need to. Her nervous system had been calibrated in Helmand Province to read threat patterns the way most people read text, automatic, subconscious, lethal in its accuracy. The angle of their shoulders. The way their tactical vests sat wrong under their jackets. The absence of urgency in their gait despite the trauma bay setting. These weren't paramedics. These weren't hospital staff. These were men operating on a target acquisition pattern, moving with the fluid precision of apex predators, and they were moving toward Bay 7. Where General Marcus Webb was sleeping off sedation 2 rooms down. Her hands didn't pause on the medication vials. This was the distance between civilian and soldier, the ability to keep moving while the threat assessment happened in real time, subcortical, automatic as breathing. 3 men. 2 with the bulge profile of compact firearms under their left ribs. 1 with comms in his ear. Entry pattern suggesting they'd already cleared the ambulance bay security with either credentials or force. No visible blood on them yet, which meant the force part hadn't happened here. Somewhere else. Somewhere before they walked into her hospital. Natalie finished counting. 32 ampoules. She catalogued the nearest exit routes, the trauma bay doors, the supply closet door that opened to the back corridor, the stairwell she'd walked past 6 times on her rounds. She calculated response angles, the distance from her current position to General Webb's bed, the civilian staff density in the department at 2:19 a.m. on a Thursday. 2 residents. 1 attending. 1 nursing student. For nurses including her. A janitor somewhere in the West Wing. Too many variables. All of them too soft. She moved. Not fast. Fast draws attention. She moved with the economy of someone who'd managed a bleeding patient in a fire base with incoming fire, who'd held a man's spine together with her hands in a corridor lit by muzzle flash, who'd learned that survival lived in the space between visible and invisible. The medication cart rolled back to its station. Her badge caught the fluorescent light as she turned toward the patient rooms. 5 paces. 10. The 3 men had cleared the ambulance bay doors and were moving deeper into the department with the certainty of men who'd already decided the shape of what came next. She reached Bay 7 in 17 seconds. General Webb's eyes were closed, the sedative keeping him in that grey space between consciousness and nothing. The foot dripped steadily. His monitor traced a clean rhythm across the screen, sinus, steady, unaware that the next 2 minutes would redefine the word velocity. Natalie positioned herself between the doorway and his bed. Not in front of it. Between. Her hips angled. Her right side forward, left back, weight distributed the way she'd learned to distribute it in rooms where positioning meant the difference between leaving vertically or horizontal. Her hands rested at her sides, palms forward. Relaxed. The kind of relaxed that comes from knowing exactly what your body could do. The first man through the door was tall. Military bearing gone to civilian softness in his shoulders, but his hand said something different. His hands were still a soldier's hands, just older, meaner, holding a SIG SAU with the familiarity of a man who'd pointed that particular gun at something that mattered. The second man was broader, with scarring across his left temple like someone had tried to open his skull with a utility knife and mostly succeeded. The third stayed back, covering the corridor, hand inside his jacket. Step aside, nurse. The tall one didn't raise his voice. Men who had to raise their voices to be threatening had already failed the threat assessment. Not happening. Her voice dropped an octave. No please. No apology. Just the tone of someone who'd made the calculation and found it wanting. The tall man's eyebrows moved. Just slightly. Like he'd issued a command to a machine and the machine had declined the instruction. He'd probably had that happen 3 times in his life. Maybe 4. The second man with the temple scarring had probably had it happen twice. They'd both decided in the next 0.3 seconds that a nurse standing between them and their target was a variable worth removing from the equation. He raised the gun. The sound came before the impact. A small sound, almost domestic. The SIG SAU had a quality suppressor, military grade, the kind that made the shot sound like someone dropping a heavy book on linoleum. The round took her in the right shoulder, high, near the clavicle, and the ballistic physics of it punched her backward a step. The pain was information. All pain was. Soft tissue damage, no structural fracture, significant hemorrhage coming in 5 to 8 seconds. She didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge it with anything resembling a recognition response. Just recalculated. The second shot came while her feet were still moving. Her abdomen, right side, probably the kidney or the liver, and she felt something hot and wrong bloom through her lower torso like a flower opening in fast forward. Her hands moved anyway. Muscle memory took over. She grabbed the crash cart railing with her left hand to stay vertical. The third shot went through her thigh, right side, the femoral area, and that one made her vision grey at the edges because femoral wounds were the kind that drained a person in under 4 minutes if they weren't managed correctly. The fourth shot caught her on a side, ribs, and she heard something crack in her chest, not bone, something worse, something that involved lungs and blood and the kind of consequence that made her breath come in patterns she hadn't had to think about since Sanjin Valley. The fifth shot was fast. Barely a pause between 4 and 5. It grazed her neck, hot line of fire across her right side, and the spray of arterial blood from her carotid laceration painted the wall behind her in a pattern that looked almost artistic if you didn't understand what it meant. She went down hard. The linoleum was cold. That was the first thing. Cold and slick with her own blood, and her cheek hit it at an angle that would have made her teeth snap if her body wasn't already running on shutdown protocols designed for exactly this scenario. The sound of General Webb screaming something was distant, underwater, like he was calling from the other side of a thick window. The security alarm was screaming too. The two intruders had maybe 90 seconds before the Denver Police Department started responding to the hospital panic, before the ballistics became a problem they couldn't solve with a suppressor and an exit strategy. The gunshots cut them off at 60 seconds exactly. Boots on linoleum. Fast. Running. Someone had a rifle now, something bigger than a handgun, the kind of bark that made the fluorescent lights rattle in their fixtures. She heard the taller man go down first, the distinctive wet silence that meant organ failure, and then the second man stopped shooting and started running. The security team had radioed ahead. "We're getting support from the Denver PD unit that had been doing patrol near the hospital because someone had called ahead, because the threat pattern had been identified, because the next 90 seconds had never been about random home invasion violence." They'd been expecting this. Or expecting something. Someone had known. Natalie couldn't turn her head far enough to see who'd called. Couldn't move her right arm at all. The shoulder shot had severed something that meant her body had decided that arm was no longer part of the network. Her vision was going grey. Not fading. Tunneling. The way it tunneled when you'd lost enough blood that your brain was making decisions about which parts of sensory input mattered. The padding on her left side meant the bullet had gone through and through. The burning in her abdomen meant internal bleeding, meant she was drowning from the inside. Her lung was collapsing, she could feel the tension pneumothorax building, the pressure in her chest increasing, the way it increased when air got into the wrong spaces. Dr. Chen was there. The night resident, tall kid, maybe 28, with the hands of someone who'd never held someone together while they were actively falling apart. His face was the color of institutional paint and his eyes were doing that thing eyes did when they registered the specific mathematics of mortality. Natalie opened her mouth. Got blood in it. Her voice came out like she was speaking through water. "Chen. Crash cart. Now." He didn't move. Froze the way civilians froze when their training equations didn't match what their eyes were reporting. "Do it or let me die." Her words were clipping. Short. Fractured. "Your choice. But make it now." The crash cart appeared. She'd never actually seen him move to get it. Just suddenly it was beside her and her left hand, the one that still worked, was reaching for the scalpel. The blade was silver, caught the overhead light, and she could feel her own shaking trying to start in her fingers, but she locked it down hard, the way you locked down everything when you were on borrowed time and the clock was running faster than it should. "I'm going to perform a field thoracotomy," she said. Her voice was steady. This was the thing that separated soldiers from everyone else. The ability to have conversations about your own mortality while your body was actively failing. You're going to clamp the bleeder in my abdomen when I tell you. Chen's eyes went wide. His mouth opened. No sound came out. I can't. You need surgery. You need. Do exactly what I say. Her left hand positioned the scalpel below her own ribcage. The angle had to be perfect. The entry had to avoid the internal organs that weren't already damaged. She pressed down and cut, felt the resistance of her own skin giving way to the blade's edge. The pain was enormous. Impossible. The kind of pain that belonged to someone else, someone farther away. She pushed through it. Or past it. Or around it. The cut opened and she was pulling her own ribs apart, cutting through the pericardium, and her hand was inside her own chest cavity, finding the hemorrhage, finding the bleeder, her vision narrowing to just the work and nothing else. Her other hand, the one that wasn't good for much else anymore, was already on her phone. Already accessing the hospital system with the password that wasn't supposed to exist. Already pulling General Webb's medical records. His location data. Everything that the three men's network would have tried to extract if they'd had another 2 minutes and silence to work with. She was deleting it. Wiping it. Making him invisible in every database they could have accessed. Blood pooled around her. Slick and dark, and the kind of wrong that meant she was running down a clock that stopped at 0. Clamp, she said. Here. Exactly here. Dr. Chen's hands were shaking so hard she almost didn't think he'd be able to manage it. But he did. He clamped. The bleeding inside her slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. Her vision was fading now. Going grey at the edges. Going somewhere that wasn't this linoleum floor. Get security. Get the data locked down. Nobody accesses Webb's file. The voices were getting farther away. Dr. Pierce was there, she could hear him, that particular timbre of his voice, that quality of certainty that meant he'd already decided what this was, what she was. Not "Are you okay?" Not "Get her to surgery." An accusation. What the hell did you do? They were lifting her. The movement made her ribcage scream. Made her body remember it was broken in 5 separate places, that blood was still leaking into spaces where blood didn't belong. She heard the code being called. Heard the organized chaos that was Seattle General Surgery Team mobilizing. Heard Pierce's voice moving away, already on his phone, already building his narrative. Emergency board meeting. This nurse just went full vigilante. This is what happens when you let operational thinking override hospital protocol. She was in the ambulance now. The rotor wash was starting somewhere, the sound building, the specific mechanical rhythm of a life flight helicopter spinning up for emergency transport. She'd heard that sound before. Different context. Same mathematics. She'd made the choice. Webb was going to live. The data was scrubbed. Everything else could wait. The scalpel came from the crash cart. Natalie's hand was steady as she made the incision, even though her own blood pooled dark and spreading across the linoleum like spilled coffee. 5 bullet wounds. Shoulder. Abdomen. Thigh. Side. Neck, a graze that felt like fire but had missed the carotid by millimeters. The pain wasn't agony anymore. Pain was information. Pain was data telling her exactly how much time she had left. She talked the resident through it, her voice level as a surgical laser. Left anterolateral thoracotomy. 4th intercostal space. You're looking for the pericardium. Her own hands worked while she instructed. One hand pressing gauze against the abdominal wound, the other guiding the resident's trembling fingers. You'll see fluid around the heart. That's blood. We're decompressing it. Slow. Controlled. The resident's face had gone white, his lips moving without sound. She caught his eye. You've trained for this. Your hands know what to do. Let them. The monitor above General Webb's bed beeped steadily. Sinus rhythm. He was stable. That was the only thing that mattered. Her laptop sat on the supply cart 6 feet away. She'd pulled it from the break room 15 minutes before the shooting, before she'd even known the shooting was coming, though her body had known something was wrong the way predators know when prey has spotted them. The hospital's data architecture was pathetic. Security theater. She'd been extracting Webb's classified medical records and communications for days, feeding them to the handlers waiting in a dark van 2 blocks north. The general's location data, his injury assessments, the interdiction operations he'd been coordinating. The men in tactical gear had come for that intelligence. They'd come for him. While Natalie's left hand held her own abdomen together, her right hand typed. The cursor blinked across the screen. General Webb's location, classified, transfer approved, route secured. One keystroke. Then another. The data was scrubbed. Everything else could wait. The resident's voice cracked. Is she? Should we call someone? Call nobody, Natalie said quietly. Just clamp the bleeding. Watch the vitals. You're doing it right. She didn't look down at the floor. Didn't watch the blood spreading or count how many breaths she had left. Muscle memory wasn't just a phrase. It was survival. It was the difference between soldiers who kept fighting and soldiers who became statues. Her training had taught her to compartmentalize pain the way engineers compartmentalize a sinking ship. You seal the bulkhead. You keep the ship afloat long enough to reach port. When the security team brought down the 3 shooters, she was still conscious. Still vertical. Still holding her own life together with one hand while the other confirmed the data deletion on her laptop screen. All secure. The intelligence was safe. General Webb was stable. The mission was complete. Then she felt herself falling like a building with its supports removed, and the fluorescent lights overhead became a blur of white, and someone was shouting code blue, and the world went soft and dark. She woke in recovery 36 hours later with 2 units of blood in her veins and a security guard stationed outside her door. Not a guard. A barrier. The hospital badge that hung from the 4-pole beside her bed was dark. No magnetic strip. No access. The nursing supervisor came by at 8 a.m. with a folder in her hands and wouldn't meet Natalie's eyes. There's a hold on your clearance pending investigation, she said quietly, which meant the executive level had already decided. Your access to patient records is suspended. Your shift assignments are cancelled effective immediately. There's a board hearing scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main conference room. Natalie's throat was sandpaper. The sutures pulled when she tried to swallow. The General. General Webb is stable. He's asking about you, but security has been instructed not to confirm your status. The supervisor's hands twisted the folder. Dr. Pierce called an emergency board meeting while you were in surgery. He presented evidence of what he's calling a pattern of reckless behavior. He brought investigators. There's already an outside review underway. I stopped the shooters. You also violated approximately 14 hospital protocols in doing so. You accessed secured systems. You removed General Webb's patient data from our system without authorization. You escalated a situation that should have been handled by security protocol. The supervisor's voice was gentle, which made it worse. Dr. Pierce has statements from nursing staff about your history of insubordination, your unwillingness to follow chain of command, your pattern of overstepping your scope of practice. He's painted this as evidence of instability. Natalie closed her eyes. She'd known this was coming the moment she made the decision to stand between those guns and Webb's bed. Covers didn't survive contact with reality. They burned away like paper in a furnace. There's termination paperwork being prepared, the supervisor continued. Effective upon your discharge from medical care. The board will vote at 2 p.m., but the vote is likely formality at this point. Dr. Pierce has already mobilized the donors. He spoke to the hospital foundation director at 6 a.m. By 8 a.m., he'd contacted people at the top of the administrative chain who've already indicated they're prepared to support immediate termination pending investigation. Pending investigation, Natalie echoed. He couldn't wait until I was out of surgery. No. The supervisor set the folder on the bedside table and finally looked at her. He couldn't. That told me everything I needed to know about whether this was about patient safety or about something else. After the supervisor left, Natalie lay still. The IV hissed softly. The cardiac monitor beeped. Outside her room, the hallway moved at its normal clinical pace, pages overhead, the rattle of medication carts, the murmur of voices that didn't include hers anymore. Everything in a hospital was designed to move on without individual people. People were data. People were files. People were positions to be filled. General Webb tried to visit her at noon. A security guard turned him back at her door. She saved my life, Webb said, his voice loud enough for Natalie to hear through the door. She's a hero. Sir, I have clear instructions. No visitors on this room. Medical security protocol. Webb didn't know who she was. Not really. He remembered a face from Helm and Province, a medic who'd held the line after the others fell back. But he didn't know Natalie Hayes. He didn't know Captain Phantom. He didn't know the woman who'd spent 16 years building this cover, layer by layer, brick by brick, until she'd almost believed it herself. He only knew the nurse who'd bled out on a hospital floor to protect him. That wasn't enough. It was never enough. Covers didn't survive the real world. At 1:38 p.m., a security escort arrived with discharge paperwork and a plastic bag containing her personal effects. They wheeled her downstairs despite her protests that she could walk. The escort, a man named Chris who'd always been kind before today, wouldn't make eye contact. Just policy, he said quietly. Board hearing is in the conference room. Dr. Pierce asked us to ensure you're present. He meant ensure you attend your own execution. The conference room smelled like expensive carpet and the faint ozone-electric smell of a building where important decisions happened. Long table. Board members arranged like judges. Dr. Pierce at the head, his expression the exact mirror of satisfaction wearing a human face. The termination file sat open in front of him, her file, her application, her references, each section highlighted in yellow as if he'd marked the body for dissection. Miss Hayes, one of the board members said, a woman whose nameplate read Director Morrison. The board has reviewed the incident report from 2 nights ago. We appreciate your quick thinking in an emergency, but we have serious concerns about how that situation was handled. Dr. Pierce has documented a pattern of protocol violations, unauthorized access to secured systems, and insubordination that suggests. The door slammed open. A 16-year-old boy in a school uniform stood in the doorway holding a showbox like a football. His face was flushed. His hand shook. Mom, they need to see these. Natalie's blood stopped moving. Ryan, no, she tried to stand, but the world tilted. The wounds pulled like fish hooks. He crossed the conference room in 4 strides and dumped the contents onto the polished table. Medals scattered like coins. Purple Heart. Silver Star. Bronze Star with a V for Valor. Combat Action Ribbon. Unit citations. Each one a piece of the life she'd buried. Each one proof that Captain Phantom was real, that Natalie Hayes had been something other than a nurse, that 16 years of invisible sacrifice had left evidence that couldn't be explained away with protocol violations. General Webb wheeled himself into the room behind Ryan, still connected to his IV pole, his face the color of old bone. He stared at the medals on the table, then up at Natalie. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, Phantom. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain starting outside, pattering against the windows like applause. Colonel Sarah Vance stepped in behind them, from Natalie's old unit, pulled from wherever she'd been waiting in Denver, standing in dress blues with ribbons that caught the fluorescent light. She picked up the silver star with the care of someone handling a holy thing. Captain Natalie Hayes, United States Marine Corps Special Operations. Vance's voice carried the weight of courtroom walls and marble memorials. For extraordinary valor in Helmand Province. Captain Hayes single-handedly held a forward field hospital against enemy combatants for 14 hours, treating wounded under continuous fire. 17 personnel evacuated. 0 friendly casualties. Multiple gunshot wounds sustained. Refused evacuation until relief forces arrived. Demonstrated exceptional courage, tactical competence, and willingness to place herself in direct harm's way to protect the lives of her unit. Dr. Pierce's face had gone the color of hospital walls, bleached white, empty of blood. I don't care about her little medals. This is about hospital protocol, Anne. General Webb struggled to his feet, his forepaw knocking against the table. His hand came up rigid to his forehead, a salute. Shaking. Deliberate. His eyes locked on Natalie's face like she was the only real thing in the room. You held the line after they pulled you. I took your place. His voice cracked. The IED that got me. That sector was supposed to be yours. You saved my life twice, and I didn't even know who you were the first time. The Pentagon liaison who'd materialized in the doorway spoke quietly. Captain Hayes' nursing assignment at Seattle General was classified counterintelligence work. Those men came for General Webb's intelligence on Coast Guard interdiction operations. Captain Hayes prevented a major security breach and saved military assets that will take months to recalibrate. He paused. There's also the fact that she performed an emergency field thoracotomy on herself during active fire. That procedure has a 2% survival rate under hospital conditions. She executed it on linoleum with a crash cart scalpel while manually extracting classified data. That's not protocol violation. That's extraordinary valor repeated twice in one night. Ryan's eyes had filled with tears. He looked at his mother like she was someone he'd never met before, which, Natalie realized, he was. Mom, you're a Marine. She reached out. Her bandaged hand shook like an old woman's. I'm your mom. That's the most important part. But he'd already seen the medals. He'd already seen the truth. Dr. Pierce's phone began to buzz. Then again. Then 3 times in rapid succession. His color shifted from white to red like a time-lapse video of sunrise in reverse. Someone was filming. Someone had already posted. 2 days of staring at a diner wall at 3 in the morning with coffee going cold in a ceramic cup that read Denver's finest. Natalie sat alone in the back booth, the kind of place that never closed because the owner understood that some people needed somewhere to exist when the rest of the world was sleeping. Her reflection in the window behind the booth was hollow. Not tired. Hollow. The kind of hollow that comes from realizing your sacrifice meant nothing because the mission you thought you were protecting had already slipped through your fingers like water. The mission was over. She'd blown her cover. Her identity as a nurse was burned to ash. And the intelligence General Webb carried, the network of operatives, the black site locations, the financial trails that ran from Denver to 3 continents, none of it mattered now because she hadn't protected it. She'd spent 14 hours in Helmand Province holding a field hospital with her hands and her will and a borrowed M4, and she'd done it to prove she could be trusted with this kind of work. Then they'd yanked her out, given her the nursing identity, told her it was temporary, told her to wait. 2 years she'd waited. 2 years of deferring to men like Dr. Pierce, of accepting insults with a jaw clench and nothing more, of keeping her hand steady while her entire existence became a fiction. The jacket hung on the hook beside the booth. She reached for it, her fingers finding the interior lining without looking. The faded unit patch was there where she'd sewn it herself, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse Company, the only piece of her real life she'd allowed herself to keep. The only reminder that somewhere beneath the scrubs and the name badge and the apologetic posture, there was still a warrior. She ran her thumb across the worn embroidered edges and the symbolism felt like a mockery now. Like keeping a gun that wouldn't fire. Like wearing a medal with no one left to salute it. The board hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. For board members, a hospital administrator, Dr. Pierce at the head of the table with her termination paperwork already prepared, his smile the kind that apex predators wear before the kill. They'd made it clear through hospital counsel that her reckless vigilante behavior had triggered an immediate investigation into her fitness for practice. The shooting was self-defense. The thoracotomy was textbook emergency medicine. The intelligence extraction was treason by their legal definition, which meant she couldn't defend it without revealing the classified operation, which meant they'd destroy her in silence while she sat there and took it. She was going to sit there and take it. That's what operatives did. Disappeared quietly. Let the cover story be the final story. But that wasn't how it happened. The conference room door burst open at 9:17 a.m. Not knocked. Burst. Ryan stood in the doorway with his mother's height and his father's stubborn jaw, 16 years old and furious, holding a showbox like it was the nuclear football. His voice broke the careful silence that Dr. Pierce had been cultivating, the silence of bureaucratic execution. "Mom, they need to see these." Natalie's hands, which had been steady through 5 gunshot wounds and 14 hours of combat medicine, moved without permission. She stood. "Ryan, no. Leave. Now." He didn't leave. He opened the show box. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Another Purple Heart. Silver Star. The medals caught the fluorescent light like accusations. Like evidence. Like the truth arriving 6 years too late. General Webb was pale. The four-pole beside his wheelchair rattled as his hand gripped the armrest. When he whispered the word, it was the first time anyone at that table had heard him speak anything but careful pleasantries. Phantom. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that occurs when a myth steps out of legend and says hello. Dr. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. His face was a study in a man watching his narrative collapse in real time. He reached for his papers. Some part of him still believed in the power of the table, the authority of his position, the way words typed on official letterhead could erase what he was seeing. A Marine colonel stepped forward from the doorway. Someone must have called ahead, must have already known this moment was coming. His uniform was dress blues, which meant he'd anticipated formality. His voice was the kind that commands respect because it was earned at a cost most people couldn't imagine. Captain Natalie Hayes. For extraordinary valor in Helmand Province. Single-handedly holding a field hospital against enemy combatants for 14 hours while sustaining critical injuries. Maintaining operational security despite life-threatening hemorrhage. Protecting intelligence assets at the cost of her cover. Dr. Pierce tried to interrupt after the third line. His mouth was open, some pathetic attempt at objection forming, but General Webb moved. The man who'd been shot twice in his military career, who'd taken a round through the shoulder just 48 hours earlier, struggled to attention with the four-pole beside him. Not standing. Struggling. Using every ounce of will to achieve something that should have been impossible. His right hand rose in a salute. A decorated Coast Guard general, decorated enough that his name appeared in Pentagon briefings, was saluting a nurse in a Denver hospital conference room. Was saluting her Purple Heart. Was saluting her Silver Star as Ryan placed them gently on the glass table like treasures recovered from the deep. Someone was filming. The angle suggested it was deliberate, someone who'd anticipated this and positioned themselves in the corner. By evening, the video had 400,000 views. By the next morning, 4 million. Dr. Pierce's voice was so clear in the audio, I don't care about her little medals. This woman broke hospital protocol, tampered with patient records, and behaved like a vigilante instead of a nurse. A decorated general stood at attention behind him, saluting a Purple Heart, the visual irony cutting deeper than any words could. The phone call started before sunrise. Dr. Pierce's former mentor at Johns Hopkins Medical School, Dr. Raymond Garrett, a man who'd lost both legs in Desert Storm and spent 30 years teaching the next generation of trauma surgeons, left a voicemail that the hospital secretary, in an act of beautiful administrative sabotage, played on the board speakerphone during their emergency meeting. His voice came through the speaker like judgment, "James, I taught you medicine, not cruelty. That woman has more courage in her trigger finger than you've shown in your entire career. If the board doesn't remove you within 48 hours, I'm pulling every single recommendation I ever wrote for you. Everyone. The veteran donors started calling. The ones whose foundations funded hospital wings, whose names were on plaques in the lobby. One by one, their message was identical: remove him or we redirect our donations to hospitals that understand what honor means. The nursing staff came forward with stories, methodical, documented accounts of how Dr. Pierce had systematically undermined nurses he deemed inferior, had poisoned references for staff members he resented, had weaponized his authority in ways that made patient care suffer. The pattern was damning. The paper trail was meticulous. General Webb submitted a formal statement through Pentagon legal counsel. Dr. James Pierce attempted to prevent Captain Hayes from executing her operational mandate. His interference during the emergency could have resulted in my death and a catastrophic intelligence breach affecting national security operations across 3 continents. It was enough. The hospital placed Dr. Pierce on immediate administrative leave within 48 hours. His wife left him when reporters started camping outside their house on Mapleton Avenue. His private practice patients cancelled en masse. The medical community that once feared his influence now distanced itself with the precision of sharks sensing blood in a tide they hadn't made. Within 6 months, Dr. Pierce had driven out of Denver in a medical supply van headed for a rural clinic in Montana that was so desperate for staff it had stopped asking questions. His new life was a 140-mile circuit between towns of fewer than 5,000 people, administering flu shots and treating frostbite and managing chronic pain for people who'd never heard of Johns Hopkins. His Hopkins diploma was packed away in a cardboard box beside his other degrees. His authority reduced to a van full of bandages and expired magazines. 6 months later, Captain Natalie Hayes pinned her bars back onto her dress uniform in her Pentagon office overlooking the Potomac. The nursing identity had been a mission, and missions ended. Now the real work began. She was assigned to training special operations medical personnel, teaching them what she'd learned in Helmand, what she'd learned in Denver, what she'd learned about operating alone when every structure around you was designed to make you smaller. Ryan visited on weekends, finally understanding why his mom had worked double shifts, why she never talked about her past, why there was a specific kind of stillness to her that came from having survived things other people couldn't imagine. He kept one of her medals on his desk at school. General Webb requested assignment to her training program personally, insisting he needed to learn from the medic who held the line. On her office wall, she framed 2 things: the faded unit patch from her jacket lining, the only piece of her real life she'd allowed herself to keep, placed beside a photograph someone had captured during the conference room moment, the instant she stepped between the bullets and a general, the moment the quiet person in the room revealed she'd been holding everything together all along. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Did Dr. Pierce deserve what happened to him? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, hit subscribe and tell me your story. We're going to keep bringing you the truth about the people who fight in silence.